The Arabian Sea stretches endlessly beneath a gray morning sky. Somewhere in that vast expanse of water, the USS Abraham Lincoln cuts through the darkness. 65,000 tons of steel and firepower, a floating sovereign territory that answers to no one but Washington. This is what American naval dominance looks like in practice. A ship so large it requires its own city's worth of infrastructure just to operate. Within its hull, F-35 fighter jets worth $130 million each, guided missile systems that can strike targets 100 miles away, radar arrays that see everything moving across the horizon. The ship carries over 5,000 sailors and Marines, a crew so specialized that individual technicians spend years mastering single systems. But on this particular morning, the USS Abraham Lincoln wasn't just projecting power. It was about to demonstrate exactly how seriously the United States takes threats to its naval forces in contested waters. The context matters here. The relationship between Washington and Tehran had been deteriorating for months. Nuclear negotiations had collapsed. Economic sanctions had tightened to crushing levels. Trump's hardline Iran policy meant there was no diplomatic off-ramp visible on the horizon. In this environment, Iran was making a calculated decision. They would increase provocations, test American resolve, and signal to their regional allies and their own domestic audience that they were not intimidated by American military superiority. They understood they couldn't win a conventional war, but they could probe. They could test boundaries. They could gather intelligence. And each probe would cost them relatively little, while potentially revealing vulnerabilities in American defenses. The morning began like any other in the Persian Gulf region. Constant vigilance, sensors sweeping the horizon, every operator understanding that the next radar contact could be routine, significant, or genuinely threatening. The USS Abraham Lincoln's Combat Information Center is the nerve center of carrier operations. Banks of screens display every contact within 300 miles. Experienced watch officers interpret the data in real time. They've seen Iranian patrol boats before. They've tracked Iranian reconnaissance aircraft. They know the patterns. But something about this morning was different. At approximately 8:47 a.m. local time, a Shahed-139 surveillance drone appeared on radar. This aircraft matters. Unlike smaller tactical drones, the Shahed-139 is a genuine long-range reconnaissance platform. It can stay aloft for up to 24 hours. It carries significant sensor packages, cameras, infrared systems, electronic surveillance equipment. The Iranians designed it specifically for missions where they needed to observe American naval movements from beyond visual range, pushing into contested airspace to gather intelligence without committing manned aircraft that would create diplomatic incidents. The drone was flying deliberately toward the carrier strike group with unclear intent. Here's the critical moment. From the carrier's perspective, they're watching a foreign military aircraft approach their position. Protocol kicks in immediately. The Combat Information Center alerts the commanding officer. Radio operators attempt contact. Standard procedure in contested airspace demands that you try communication first. You issue warnings. You give the aircraft opportunities to identify itself and change course. These aren't arbitrary rules. They exist because previous incidents in the Persian Gulf had ended with ships damaged or personnel killed. The protocols are written in lessons learned from actual combat. The Shahed-139 continued inbound. Radio calls went unanswered. Warnings were issued in multiple languages. And the aircraft maintained its course toward the carrier strike group. At this point, the rules of engagement are clear. A foreign military aircraft approaching an American aircraft carrier with unclear intent, refusing to respond to warnings, and continuing on an intercept course represents a credible threat. The captain of the USS Abraham Lincoln had authorization to defend his ship and crew. An F-35C fighter jet launched from the flight deck. This is the stealth variant of the Lightning II fighter, a single aircraft that costs more than some nations' entire air forces. Sending a $130 million stealth fighter to intercept a surveillance drone that probably costs somewhere between $500,000 and $1 million is a decision about priorities and messaging. The United States was making clear that they would spend whatever resources necessary to prevent foreign aircraft from operating in their defensive perimeter. This wasn't about the drone's cost. This was about establishing that the Persian Gulf has boundaries, and those boundaries are enforced. The F-35C pilot achieved intercept at approximately 9:15 a.m. The Shahed-139 was still flying toward the carrier strike group. It was still not responding to warnings. At this point, the decision was made. An AIM-120 air-to-air missile, a beyond visual range weapon designed to kill enemy fighters at distances of up to 100 miles, was released from the F-35C. The drone had no defensive systems. It had no electronic countermeasures. It had no ability to evade. The missile streaked toward it at supersonic speed. Within seconds, the Shahed-139 was destroyed, falling from the sky into the Arabian Sea in pieces, sinking into depths where it would never be recovered or studied. No survivors. No warning, no second chances. If you're finding value in understanding how these operations actually work, the escalation procedures, the decision-making frameworks, the real constraints that commanding officers work within, this channel goes deeper into the tactical and strategic dimensions of modern naval operations. The comments section is where our community discusses these decisions. Were they justified, proportional, necessary? If that kind of analysis interests you, subscribe so you don't miss when we break down the next operation that reshapes how we understand military power. The message to Tehran was unmistakable. You cannot probe American forces in the Persian Gulf with impunity. But here's where the story becomes even more significant, because while the USS Abraham Lincoln was still processing what had just happened, while debris from the destroyed drone was still settling into the seabed, a second operation was already unfolding 400 miles away. The Stena Imperative is a product tanker, a relatively modest cargo ship that carries refined petroleum products. It's American-operated, which means it falls under U.S. jurisdiction while transiting international waters. The Stena Imperative was heading south through the Strait of Hormuz toward Bahrain, one of the world's most critical shipping channels, through which roughly 25% of global petroleum shipments pass. This narrow waterway is where global energy security meets geopolitical tension. The crew of the Stena Imperative detected a threat that should have been impossible given American naval presence in the region. Two Iranian Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps fast attack boats appeared at high speed. These aren't modern warships. These are speedboats, essentially militarized versions of civilian vessels, armed with machine guns and shoulder-fired weapons. They're designed for harassment and intimidation, not conventional naval warfare. But in the Strait of Hormuz, a confined space where American presence is focused on carrier operations, there's a brief window where they can operate. The IRGC boats closed at aggressive speed. According to crew accounts and official U.S. military statements, they signaled the tanker to stop. They threatened to board the vessel. They demanded the ship kill its engines. They made clear their intention was to seize the Stena Imperative and take it into Iranian waters. This is maritime piracy conducted by a state military force, technically illegal under international law, but commonly practiced in the Persian Gulf when there's uncertainty about American response. Think about what's happening operationally. While American naval power was being demonstrated in the Arabian Sea through the destruction of a surveillance drone, Iranian forces were simultaneously testing whether they could conduct maritime seizures in one of the world's most critical shipping lanes. This wasn't random. This was coordinated. Same day, same general region. But two different tests. One of air defenses, one of surface security. The Iranians were running a two-front probe to see if the Americans could simultaneously defend air superiority and protect commercial shipping. The tanker's crew, following international maritime law and their company's protocols, did not comply with the IRGC demands. They transmitted a distress signal, and U.S. naval forces in the area, specifically the USS Nitsa, a guided missile destroyer, were alerted immediately. The USS Nitsa is a modern warship, a Burt-class destroyer displacing about 9,000 tons with a crew of 330. More importantly, it carries the Phalanx close-in weapon system, capable of firing 4,500 rounds per minute. It carries Tomahawk cruise missiles. It carries modern radar systems and electronic warfare capabilities. From a conventional military perspective, it represents vastly more firepower and capability than two small IRGC speedboats could ever overcome. The Nitsa positioned itself between the IRGC boats and the Stena Imperative. This is what naval presence actually means in practice. It's not always about firing missiles or demonstrating overwhelming force through combat. Sometimes it's simply about being there, being visible, and making unmistakably clear that you will protect commercial shipping in your area of responsibility. The IRGC boats, faced with the prospect of direct confrontation with a U.S. Navy destroyer, made a rapid tactical assessment. They understood the capability disparity. They understood that continuing their approach would result in either their destruction or their capture. They broke off their approach and returned toward Iranian waters. The Stena Imperative continued on its route toward Bahrain unmolested. No shots were fired. No ships were damaged. No crews were killed. But the message was delivered and unmistakably received. Maritime seizures in the Persian Gulf will not succeed while American naval forces are present. What makes these two incidents remarkable isn't their dramatic intensity. There's no spectacular action, no explosions shown on television, no viral moment. What makes them significant is what they reveal about the actual nature of modern asymmetric conflict between powers with vastly different military capabilities. Iran cannot defeat the American Navy in conventional warfare. The gap is too wide and growing wider. Their fighter jets are older by generations. Their surface ships are fewer and less capable. Their air defense systems are no match for American strike aviation carrying standoff weapons. And critically, everyone involved understands this reality. The Iranian military leadership is not delusional about their capabilities. They know they cannot win a direct conflict. So instead of attempting to match American power directly, Iran pursues an asymmetric strategy. They send surveillance drones to gather intelligence about how American air defenses respond. They conduct aggressive harassment operations to test American patience and rules of engagement. They attempt seizures of merchant shipping to probe whether America will actually enforce its commitment to freedom of navigation. Each operation is technically deniable. These are technical reconnaissance missions or counter-smuggling operations. Each operation costs Iran relatively little in material terms. A surveillance drone represents a minor loss. Fast attack boats are inexpensive compared to the cost of major warships. But collectively, these operations serve multiple purposes simultaneously. They test American resolve, they gather intelligence, they signal to regional allies that Iran is actively challenging American dominance, and they provide proof of activity to their domestic audience. Here's where understanding the American response becomes crucial for understanding the broader strategic picture. The response was calibrated, professional, and deliberately limited in scope. The drone was destroyed. That's standard air defense. The tanker seizure was prevented. That's standard force protection. But notably, there was no escalation beyond these specific defensive actions. There was no retaliatory strike on Iranian targets. There was no bombardment of Iranian military positions. There was no blockade of Iranian waters. There was no invasion of Iranian territory. This restraint is itself a message, carefully constructed and deliberately transmitted to Tehran. It says, "We will defend our interests with precision and proportionality, but we are not seeking broader conflict. We are not using your probes as justification for escalation. We are simply defending what must be defended and moving forward." From Tehran's perspective, the day had served multiple strategic purposes. First, they gathered intelligence. They now have data about how quickly the USS Abraham Lincoln's air defense system responds to approaching aircraft. They know reaction times. They know whether the carrier group will actually use lethal force in response to a surveillance mission. That information is valuable for future operations. Second, they tested whether they could conduct maritime seizures in the Strait of Hormuz with impunity. The answer was definitively no, but the attempt provided valuable information about American response times and force deployment in that particular area. Third, they demonstrated, to their own domestic audience, to their Revolutionary Guard Corps, and to regional allies, that they were taking active measures to challenge American presence in the Gulf. This matters for internal politics and for regional signaling. Understanding the broader context is essential here. This happened during a period when US-Iran relations were at their lowest point in years. The nuclear deal had been abandoned. Economic sanctions had reached crushing levels. Trump's administration had implemented what they called maximum pressure. And within this environment, Tehran was clearly making a decision to increase provocations, to test American resolve, and to signal that despite the military imbalance, Iran would not simply accept American dominance passively. The response by US Central Command was notable for its professionalism and strategic clarity. They publicly documented what had happened. This matters for international law and for establishing a clear record. They explained their defensive actions in detail. They continued normal carrier operations without interruption. No overreaction. No unnecessary escalation, but also no tolerance for direct threats to American military assets or American-flagged commercial shipping. This is the tone that both sides understand. We respect international law, we will defend our interests, and we will not provoke you, but we also will not accept provocation. This dynamic is likely to define the coming months and years in the Persian Gulf. Iran will continue probing. The United States will continue defending. And somewhere in that interaction is a line that determines whether this remains competitive posturing or escalates into broader conflict. Both sides understand that line exists. Both sides are genuinely uncertain exactly where it is. That uncertainty is what makes the Persian Gulf one of the most dangerous bodies of water on Earth. If you're interested in how these strategic calculations actually work, the doctrines, the decision trees, the rules of engagement that govern these interactions, we explore those frameworks in depth. The Middle East is incredibly complex, and these incidents reveal patterns that repeat. If understanding those patterns interests you, the comments are open, and I want to know what aspect of Middle Eastern military doctrine you find most important. The USS Abraham Lincoln would continue its deployment. Additional carrier strike groups would be dispatched to the region in the months following these incidents. Within weeks, the USS Gerald R. Ford, the world's newest and most advanced aircraft carrier, was ordered to transit toward the Persian Gulf. Iran's maritime threat would persist. Their drone operations would continue, though with greater caution. And the cycle of probing and defending would continue, a shadow conflict that shapes global oil markets, regional stability, and the balance of power in one of the world's most strategically important regions, even though it rarely dominates international headlines because it never quite escalates into conventional warfare. The lesson being transmitted was clear and unmistakable. Asymmetric challenges to American naval power in the Persian Gulf would be met with professional, precise, and proportional responses. Iran could probe, but they would not penetrate American defenses. They could test, but they would not succeed in their objectives. They could challenge, but they would not overcome American resolve or capability. That message was understood in Tehran. Iranian military leadership made note. The Revolutionary Guard Corps assessed the implications. And within days, additional American naval assets began transiting toward the region. The signal being sent was obvious to everyone involved. America maintains its commitment to freedom of navigation and commercial shipping security in the Persian Gulf, and that commitment comes with the backing of overwhelming naval power, carefully employed but undeniably present. This is how great power competition actually works in the modern era, not through dramatic conflicts that end wars, but through constant calibration, through testing and response, through strategic messaging conducted in the spaces between actual warfare. The USS Abraham Lincoln's deployment was significant not because of one successful intercept, but because it represented the continuous assertion of American naval dominance in a region where the dominance is increasingly contested. These operations matter because they set the conditions for everything that follows: the economics, the diplomacy, the regional balance of power. If this level of strategic depth interests you, the real calculations behind military operations, how doctrine translates into actual decisions, why these seemingly minor incidents have massive geopolitical implications, then you're exactly who this channel is for. Subscribe so that when the next major operation unfolds, you'll have the context to understand what's actually happening beneath the headlines. The world's military operations are rarely covered with this kind of analytical depth, and if that's what you're looking for, you've found the right place.